isn't often that licensed games are any good. Oftentimes they range from mediocre to flat out terrible. Obviously, there are some pretty spectacular examples from GoldenEye 64 to South Park: The Stick of Truth. Thankfully, Peter Jackson's King Kong is an example of a fairly good licensed game. It switches between tense survival FPS segments with Jack and empowered brawling with King Kong, and both manage to be satisfying. Of course, this would be the console versions I'm referring to. It also released on the PSP and DS, with the Game Boy Advance getting its own kind of thing, but how intact is it on the little two-screen system? Find out as I review Peter Jackson's King Kong for the Nintendo DS. This game actually starts out slightly promising. You begin in a lower res and pixelated version of the starting area from the home console games. While it has the expected compromise of being on the DS, it can lure you into thinking it'll be a pretty alright replica. Perhaps like the PSP game, except even more graphically compromised. However, this illusion is very quickly shattered once you get past this spot. You'll find very little in this game's level design that attempts to imitate the original, with what feels laughably repetitive almost all the time. This is more true for the Jack segments, but the King Kong sections have their own problems I'll get into as I go. I'll start by talking about the things I actually like about this game, just to be fair. The first-person shooter mechanics are functional on a technical level. You can find spears, a pistol, a machine gun, a shotgun, and a sniper rifle throughout the game to switch between. The shooting mechanics work and control decently. It technically has companions that show up from time to time, the one thing you can give it over the PSP version. It also has the original mechanic of finding spears in piles, although it's kind of funny that the spear just instantly reappears once you grab one. Playing as Kong sort of feels like a rough approximation of the original. You can tell some effort was made there. You can beat Kong's chest for strength as well as do light and heavy attacks. Real shame actually fighting is a complete chore as you struggle with the controls to actually gain the upper hand. You don't even get the pleasure of rampaging through New York. Everything related to it, including a real-time moment at the top of the buildings, is a scripted cutscene. I get that it would have been compromised, but you could have at least tried. The PSP version certainly has it. Apart from being functional though, Jack's sections aren't really any better. As I mentioned before, repetitiveness is the absolute scorcher in this game. Whether you're slogging through caves with crabs or hiding from a raptor in narrow sections, the game never really feels like it has all that much going for it. Granted, I know the other versions of the game have you fighting through quite a bit too, but at least there's some variety. Things like centipede monsters, among other things, typically help break up things in those other versions, not to mention some light puzzles in between. With the DS version, I sure hope you enjoy doing things over and over again and occasionally having an AI partner clumsily try to pull a lever or something. The one thing it really does differently is that it tries to replicate the river chase with a T-Rex near the end. While it's a little wonky compared to the other versions, I will give them that. Ultimately, what really condemns this port from a gameplay perspective is the sheer lack of variety more than anything. While the shooting is functional and the Kong sections mostly work, apart from when you're trying to fight a T-Rex, it definitely feels like a rushed product. It's a shame because there is some remnant of the game in there. You might say it suffers the same problem as Metroid Prime Hunters, but a lot worse, and it doesn't even have the excuse of being multiplayer-centric. There's just not enough to keep things interesting, although I guess it's a good thing the game is fairly short because I beat it in under 3 hours. There's somewhat of a story going on here with the text interactions between the characters. It's the same basic plot as all the other games, really. I'm not even going to do a spoiler warning. Jack Black as Carl wants to head to the island to shoot a movie with Anne as the leading lady. This predictably goes wrong. Anne is captured by King Kong. They have to rescue her and get out of there. King Kong eventually gets captured, breaks free of his restraints, climbs a tall building, and is shot down by airplanes. 'Twas beauty killed the beast, the end. While the DS version is a bit more forthcoming with the story than the PSP version, since it has the characters occasionally talking to each other in the middle of it, that's really not saying much. It's a very bare-bones telling of the story, but I suppose it gets the job done. Just don't expect the most complex telling of the story here. Despite having AI companions, it's basically just one at a time, so it certainly doesn't get anywhere near the level of complexity as the home consoles from a story perspective. Plot gets a meh from me, probably the only part that isn't flat-out revulsion, so probably the game's best aspect. This this is the one spot that's actually justified to be weaker than the other versions, the graphics. That being said, they aren't completely terrible, but there's clearly a lack of care for any kind of polish. There's graphical tearing everywhere, and while I did emulate it, I checked and the same issue persists on native hardware. Granted, the PSP version also had some tearing issues, but the problem is all the more pronounced here. The overall style looks decently like the other versions. The problem comes when you look at it with any further scrutiny. I mentioned that the beginning area does a decent job imitating the look of the other versions with the stairs and everything, but it quickly devolves into very repetitive cavern sections where the fog is weirdly far more aggressive. Probably because that beginning section didn't have to worry about rendering things like enemies, but it's still pretty jarring. Then you've got things like torches that lack animations and terrible gun muzzle flashes that further bog down the whole thing. The companion characters don't look the worst in the world, but their faces, especially N's, look like they got pummeled with the ugly stick. The King Kong sections are undeniably the best looking part of the game. Maybe it's because the camera's more zoomed out, but it's much easier to see the imitation of the superior versions here. Naturally, the DS limitations are still on full display, such as pixelated sprite tree branches, but overall the highlight of the game from a presentation standpoint. That sort of makes it sting all the worse that no attempt was made to approximate the New York Rampage or make the final stand playable at all. At least the river section was decent, the last playable part of the game. The music at least sounds like the other versions. I can't imagine how they would even screw that up unless they decided to give the DS terrible chip music or something. Unfortunately, there's no voice acting for the main dialogue. While I get the DS cartridges are limited in space, there really isn't that much dialogue, so I think they could have squeezed some in there. I mean, come on, Resident Evil Deadly Silence not only had full voice acting, but it even had some FMVs. Would have at least helped to hear Jack Black as Carl, I'm just saying. There are some slight quips in the game, but could have still helped with the dialogue. Sound effects are the usual bit of being there and being serviceable. Ultimately, there's a glimmer of the better versions in the presentation, but there's an overall lack of polish that really hurts this version. The PSP version may be compromised compared to PS2 and others, but at least they did what they could to make it feel the same. While I get there's also a limitation with DS hardware, this wasn't a port, it was made from the ground up. With that in mind, there are much better DS games such as the aforementioned Metroid Prime Hunters. It may not be the worst looking game in the world even on the DS, but it's clear they were rushing this one out and it was an afterthought in the worst way. From pretty much start to finish, the game is a huge disappointment and barely even attempts to meaningfully capture aspects from the other versions. Even when it's sort of, maybe if you squint really hard, bears a resemblance, it's so butchered that you don't want to be bothered. This isn't on the DS either. There are much better FPSs on the system, and I get the feeling they could have did a much better job if this wasn't such an obvious afterthought. If you must play a portable version of Peter Jackson's King Kong, just stick with the PSP version. Aside from not having AI companions, it's superior in every way and makes a nearly perfect recreation of the console game. And if you must play an FPS on the DS, I'd actually recommend Metroid Prime Hunters over this, and not just because I'm a Metroid fan. I would even recommend GoldenEye Rogue Agent over this on the system, at least it actually has some variety. There really isn't any reason to play the DS version of this game under any circumstance. And this has been my review of Peter Jackson's King Kong for the Nintendo DS. I've got a live stream Friday at 4:30 p.m., news video next Thursday at 6 p.m., and Let's Plays at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. daily. All Eastern Standard Time, but you can always subscribe and hit that bell icon if you want to keep notified. A like is always appreciated, but I just hope you genuinely enjoyed it. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. This week's epic freebie until next Thursday is Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair. Capitalize on life, peace out, have a good one, and have a nice and pleasant day.